My name is Captain Elena Collier, and I'm 34 years old. For 12 years, the United States Army taught me how to save lives under fire, but no one ever taught me how to save my own mother from the enemy sleeping in her bed. Do you believe a single slap could bring down an entire election campaign? I stood there, in that cold hospital room, watching my stepfather, Carl, the man whose face was plastered on signs all over town, swing his open hand into my cheek. The sharp crack of flesh against flesh was louder than the steady beep of my mother's heart monitor. He thought the flimsy hospital curtain and the rhythmic beeping of the machines would swallow it all. He snarled, his face inches from mine. "You're just a broken little soldier. Who do you think you are to interfere in my business?" He was wrong. He didn't know that behind that curtain wasn't another patient, but a witness who could destroy him. And he certainly didn't know that a soldier's expertise isn't just about following orders, it's about documenting every single tactical error the enemy makes. Let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated and had to turn your pain into a weapon. This story will show you just how sweet justice can be. The first thing that hit me when I walked into room 3B at Northlake Hospital was the smell. It was a sterile chemical blend of antiseptic cleaner fighting a losing battle against the cloying sweetness of cheap lilies. Carl's lilies. They sat in a garish vase on the windowsill, their sickly scent filling the room like a toxic fog. He was there, of course, positioned perfectly by my mother's bedside, holding her hand and performing the role of the devoted husband for the afternoon nurse. His tailored suit was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He was the picture of civic virtue, the man campaigning to be our town's next deputy mayor. He looked up as I entered, his face breaking into a practiced, charming smile. "Well, look who it is," he said, his voice a smooth, polished baritone that always set my teeth on edge. "Our little warrior. Did you bring the desert back with you?" The words dripped with condescension, a backhanded jab at both my career and my presence. To him, I wasn't a daughter coming to see her sick mother. I was an unwelcome soldier, tracking sand from some foreign battlefield into his carefully curated domestic scene. I ignored the jibe and focused on my mother. Linda lay propped against the pillows, her eyes hazy and unfocused. In the Army, you learn to perform a rapid assessment under pressure. It becomes instinct. I wasn't just looking at my mom, I was evaluating a patient. Her pupils were constricted, her reaction to the overhead fluorescent light sluggish. Her skin, usually warm and rosy, had a pale, waxy sheen. These weren't the signs of simple post-op fatigue. These were the classic textbook signs of an opioid overdose. My eyes darted to her IV stand, then to the chart hanging at the foot of her bed. The dosage of fentanyl was listed in clear black print. My breath caught in my throat. It was triple the standard dose for a woman her size recovering from knee surgery. It was dangerously high. Carl must have seen the look on my face. He stood up and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look comforting, but felt like an assertion of control. "Your mom's just a little tired, that's all. The doctor said it's perfectly normal." He was lying, and he knew I knew it. He was challenging me, daring me to question his authority right there in front of her. His smile never wavered, but his eyes were cold as chips of ice. He was enjoying this. Just then, my mother's phone buzzed on the bedside table. Carl picked it up, his thumb swiping across the screen. I watched in disbelief as he typed a reply to one of her friends from the garden club. His text was filled with the cheerful, slightly ditzy emojis my mom always used. "Feeling so much better," he typed, adding a flower and a smiley face. "Carl is taking such good care of me." He'd perfected her voice, her mannerisms. It struck me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't new. He had been controlling her life, her very words, for a long time. He put the phone down and pulled a thick sheaf of papers from his leather briefcase. Power of attorney, medical directives, financial documents. My stomach twisted into a tight, cold knot. "Just a few things to sign, my love," he cooed, placing a pen in her limp hand. "Just so I can take care of everything for you." That was it. My training, my duty, my entire being screamed in protest. The Hippocratic oath I took when I graduated medical school echoed in my mind. First, do no harm. And this was harm. I stepped forward, placing my hand firmly over the documents before my mother could even attempt to make a mark. Her unfocused eyes drifted towards me, a flicker of confusion in their depths. She's on a high-dose narcotic, Carl, I said, my voice low and steady, a field medic's tone. She is not legally competent to sign anything right now. The charming facade shattered. His smile tightened into a sneer. Is that an order, Captain Collier? He said, his voice laced with venom. He deliberately used my professional title, turning it into an insult. This is a family matter, not a military operation. You have no jurisdiction here. He was trying to dismiss me, to invalidate my very presence as a daughter. But then he did something even worse, something so subtly cruel it took my breath away. He looked at me, a flicker of triumph in his eyes, and said, Besides, Linda and I have already discussed this, haven't we, sweetheart? It's for the best. He then turned to me. I don't see how this concerns a Peterson. Peterson, my father's last name, the name my mother had before she married him. It was a calculated strike, a precise and vicious attempt to sever my connection to my deceased father, to erase his legacy and my place in this family in a single word. It was his way of saying, you are not his daughter. You are not her daughter. You are nothing. For a moment, all I could hear was the rushing of blood in my ears, the raw, unfiltered rage of a soldier who had just watched her commanding officer get shot. But I didn't scream. I didn't raise my voice. The army had hammered discipline into me until it was part of my bone marrow. You don't react. You act. I held his gaze, my own eyes unblinking. I didn't argue. I didn't debate. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and tapped the screen. The small red circle of the voice recorder app glowed silently. I placed the phone on the bedside table, next to the half-empty glass of water, the microphone pointing directly at him. If this is all for Mom's benefit, I said, my voice as calm and sterile as the room around us, then I'm sure you won't mind if I record this, just to make sure everything is transparent. For her protection, of course. Carl froze. The condescending smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic. His eyes darted from my face to the phone and back again. The smooth, confident politician was gone, and in his place was a cornered animal. For the first time since I had known him, I saw a crack in his flawless armor. He had miscalculated. He had assumed I would be emotional, that I would be the hysterical daughter. He never expected me to be a soldier on her home ground, quietly documenting a tactical error. And I knew, in that chilling silence broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor, that this was just the first. I drove home from the hospital that evening in a cold, disciplined fury. There were no tears, no frantic phone calls. The confrontation with Carl hadn't broken me, it had activated me. It was like flipping a switch from daughter to officer. Back at my mother's house, I refused to think of it as Carl's. I walked straight past the living room. I couldn't bear to look at the wall above the fireplace where my father's official army portrait used to hang. I knew what I would see instead. A ridiculously large, grinning campaign photo of Carl, his arm around my mother. He told her they needed to live in the present, a phrase that was just a polite way of saying her past needed to be erased. My childhood bedroom, with its faded floral wallpaper and worn oak desk, became my temporary command center. The comforting nostalgia was gone, replaced by the stark urgency of a mission. I set up my laptop, the glow of the screen casting long shadows on the walls. In the military, they'd taught me OSINT, open source intelligence. It's the art of finding out everything you need to know about a target using publicly available information. It's digging. It's connecting dots no one else sees. I wasn't just searching for information anymore. I was hunting a financial predator, and I was going to follow his trail until I found his lair. For hours, I worked. The only sounds were the clicking of my keyboard and the low hum of the computer. My face, reflected in the dark screen, was a mask of concentration, impassive, focused, detached. It was the same face I wore in a field hospital, triaging casualties. Emotion was a liability I couldn't afford. I started with property records, cross-referencing them with business filings. And then I found it. A deed of sale for a property in Oak Hills, transferred 3 months ago to a shell corporation with a Delaware address. My heart didn't just sink, it felt like it had been ripped from my chest. The Oak Hills cabin. It wasn't just a vacation home. It wasn't just an asset. It was a promise. The memory washed over me, so vivid I could almost smell the pine needles and the damp earth after a summer rain. I was 18, home on leave just before Dad's final deployment. We were sitting on the porch swing he'd built with his own hands, watching the sunset paint the lake in strokes of orange and purple. He put his arm around me, his voice rough with unspoken emotion. "When you come home from the war, Lainey," he'd said, using his pet name for me, "this place will be here. This will be your peace." Carl hadn't just sold a house, he'd sold my sanctuary. He'd sold my father's last promise to me. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I pushed it down, turning the grief into fuel. This wasn't just about money, this was about reclamation. Next, I turned to online marketplaces. It was a long shot, but I had a hunch. I typed Carl's username, the same arrogant, self-important handle he used for everything, into eBay's search bar. A list of completed sales appeared. My blood ran cold. He had sold everything. My father's stamp collection, the one he'd started with his own father when he was just a boy. Sold for $53, his old Timex watch, the one with the cracked leather strap that he wore every single day. Sold for $27. I scrolled down, my dread growing with each item. And then I saw it. The item that shattered my composure. My father's medals. The bronze star. The purple heart. All of them mounted in a shadow box he'd been so proud of. Carl had listed them under the category collectibles. The description he wrote was a desecration. Vintage military memorabilia. Great for den decoration. Decoration. He had taken my father's courage, his sacrifice, his very blood spilled on foreign soil, and reduced it to a cheap accessory for some stranger's man cave. That's when the tears finally came. Not loud, racking sobs, but silent. Hot tears of pure, undiluted rage that streamed down my face and dripped onto the keyboard. My father's words echoed in my head, a creed he'd drilled into me since I was a child. "Honor is the only thing you take with you when you go, Lainey. Don't you ever let anyone take it from you." Carl hadn't just taken it from my father, he was trying to take it from me too. Digging deeper, I hacked into my mother's email account, a necessary breach of privacy I would apologize for later. I searched for anything related to my father's belongings. I found an email chain from 2 years ago. The subject line was, "The guitar." My heart ached. It was my dad's old acoustic Martin, the one he taught me to play Blackbird on. My mother's email was a desperate, heartbreaking plea. "Please, Carl, don't sell it. It's the last piece of him I really have left. It means the world to Elena." Carl's reply was only one line, but it was the most evil thing I had ever read. It was emotional blackmail, honed to a razor's edge. "You have to choose, Linda. Me or the ghosts of the past." He had made her choose between the living and the dead. And in her grief, in her vulnerability, she had chosen him. He hadn't just sold things. He had systematically dismantled her past, isolating her from every memory of the man she had loved until he was the only thing she had left. That was enough. I stood up from the desk, my movements stiff. I went to the printer and began printing everything: the deed of sale, the LLC filings, the screenshots of the eBay auctions, the email exchange. Page after page of methodical cruelty. I cleared the corkboard on my bedroom wall, the one that used to be covered in photos of high school friends and concert tickets. I started pinning up the evidence. I used pushpins to mark the shell corporations, the bank accounts, the buyers. Then I took a spool of red thread and began connecting them. A line from the house sale to the LLC. A line from the LLC to a bank account in Carl's name. A line from his eBay account to that same bank. A web. An intricate, disgusting web of deceit. When I was done, I stepped back. The wall looked like something out of an FBI thriller, a chaotic map of a criminal conspiracy. But to me, it was crystal clear. It was a battle plan. I looked at the grinning face of Carl in a newspaper clipping I'd pinned to the center, the architect of all this pain. My voice, when I spoke to the empty room, was no longer my own. It was cold. It was hard. It was the voice of a soldier who had just been given her target. The reconnaissance is over, I said. This is war. With my wall of evidence staring back at me, I believed I had an arsenal. I thought the facts were enough. But a war isn't won with intelligence alone. You need allies. You need someone in the trenches with you. So I made the call I thought would guarantee backup. I called Sergeant Mark Renshaw, my best friend from my last tour in Afghanistan. We'd been through hell together. He'd seen me set bones under mortar fire. I trusted him with my life. I was sure he would trust me now. I laid out the facts for him, my voice calm and methodical, just like I was giving a mission briefing. I told him about the fentanyl dosage, the Shell Corporation, the metals sold for pocket change. I waited for his outrage, for him to say, "What do you need, Laney? I'm on the next flight." Instead, there was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was hesitant, filled with a pity that felt worse than any accusation. "Elena, listen," he started, and I knew what was coming. You've been through a lot. We both have. Are you sure you're seeing this clearly? Maybe what you saw over there. Maybe it's coloring things a little." He didn't say the letters, PTSD, but they hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. Carl Whitaker is a public figure, running for office. He wouldn't be that stupid. The line went dead, but his words kept echoing in my ears. He hadn't just doubted my story, he had diagnosed me. He had taken 12 years of service, of sacrifice, of watching friends die, and twisted it into a pathology. My greatest source of strength had been reframed as my biggest weakness. The wound he inflicted was deeper and more painful than any piece of shrapnel. The next morning, armed with a desperate, foolish hope, I drove to the hospital. I thought if I could just talk to the doctor, show him the dosage charts, reason with him as one medical professional to another, I could make him see. I didn't even make it past the nurse's station. A burly security guard stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to wait here." Minutes later, Dr. Albright, the chief of staff, appeared. He was a man I had once respected, a surgeon with a reputation for integrity. He approached me not with concern, but with the weary condescension of a principal dealing with a problem child. "Captain Collier," he said, his voice smooth and dismissive. "We've received a formal complaint from Mr. Whitaker. He's expressed concerns about your emotional state." He looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "Sometimes, Captain, love can cloud our judgment. Perhaps it would be best for you to get some rest." He then delivered the final blow. "For the patient's safety and well-being, your visitation rights have been suspended until further notice." He had patronized my expertise and invalidated my love in the same breath. I was no longer a daughter or a doctor. I was a threat. The very system I had sworn to uphold had now labeled me as unstable and cast me out. The door hadn't just been closed, it had been slammed and bolted in my face. Defeated, I tried one last thing. I called my mother's cell phone, praying she would be lucid enough to answer. But it was his voice that greeted me, not with words, but with a far crueler form of torture. He didn't say hello. He just left the line open. And through the speaker, I could hear him. I could hear the gentle scrape of a spoon against a bowl, and his soft, soothing voice. "Here you go, my love. Just one more bite of soup for me." And then I heard my mother's voice, weak but clear. "Oh, Carl," she murmured, "you are so good to me." He hung up. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He had used my own mother's voice as a weapon against me, proving in one swift, brutal move that he had complete control. I drove aimlessly for hours until I found myself in the deserted parking lot of a closed-down strip mall. I pulled my dad's old Ford pickup into a space at the far end, under a flickering street lamp. This truck, with its familiar scent of old leather and motor oil, had always been my safe haven. Tonight, it felt like a cage. Every door was locked, every ally had vanished, every path was blocked. The exhaustion was bone deep, a crushing weight that settled over my soul. And for the first time, I allowed myself to doubt. What if they were right? What if the horrors I'd witnessed had fractured something inside me? What if I really was the broken soldier, seeing enemies where there were only concerned family members? The thought was a poison, seeping into every part of me. I slumped forward, resting my forehead against the cold steering wheel. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt utterly and completely defeated. A steady Ohio rain began to fall, drumming a somber rhythm on the roof of the truck, the sky weeping the tears I couldn't shed. I sat there in the dark, drowning in the silence and the self-doubt. Listlessly, I turned the key in the ignition just enough to power the radio, needing some sound to fill the void. A woman's voice, warm and powerful, filled the cab. It was a podcast, one of those motivational talks I usually ignored. It was Brené Brown. And what I know for sure is that vulnerability is not weakness, she said. It's not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage. To be courageous is to show up and let ourselves be seen when we have no control over the outcome. The words cut through the fog of my despair like a searchlight. No control over the outcome. That was it. I had been trying to control everything: Mark's reaction, the hospital's decision, my mother's perception, and I had failed. But I had been looking at it all wrong. Courage wasn't about winning. It was about showing up. It was about choosing to fight, even when you're standing alone on the battlefield. I lifted my head from the steering wheel, the vinyl imprint still fresh on my forehead. I wiped the dampness from my eyes. A new resolve, forged in the depths of my darkest hour, began to harden within me. I couldn't control the outcome, but I could damn well choose the fight. And I know so many of you listening right now have had a moment just like that. A moment where the world told you that you were wrong, that you were crazy, that you were alone. If you've ever felt that way, if you've ever had to find your strength when no one else would stand with you, please support this story with a like. And in the comments, just type one word for me: fighter. Let's show the world how many of us there are. Brené Brown's words didn't give me a map, but they gave me a compass. My new direction wasn't winning, it was showing up. So I decided to show up in a way Carl couldn't possibly ignore. I had learned in my training that every system has a loophole, and I found one in the hospital's patient advocacy policies. I filed a formal request for a family care planning meeting, citing concerns about my mother's long-term care. I insisted that a hospital social worker be present to mediate. It was the perfect trap. For a man building his political campaign on the image of a devoted family man, refusing to attend a meeting about his wife's health would be a PR disaster. He had no choice but to agree. The meeting was set for the following afternoon in a small private conference room on the 3rd floor. Just before I left the house, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from my Aunt Carol, my mom's sister. The message read, "Elena, I heard you're making trouble for Carl. Please stop this nonsense. You're embarrassing the family." I stared at the words, a fresh wave of bitterness washing over me. The timing was impeccable. A stab in the back from my own family, right before I walked into battle. The message served as a stark reminder. The only backup I had was me. Carl arrived at the meeting radiating smug satisfaction. He thought he had won. He believed I had been put in my place, neutralized. The social worker, a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Gable, opened the meeting with procedural jargon. Carl nodded along, playing the part of the concerned, cooperative husband. I let them talk for a few minutes, then I calmly placed a single printed document on the table. It was the deed of sale for the Oak Hills cabin. "I'd like to discuss the liquidation of my mother's assets while she is medically incapacitated," I said, my voice even. Carl's smile faltered. He glanced at the social worker, trying to gauge her reaction. "This is a private financial matter between my wife and me," he said, his tone tight. "It became my business when you sold the last promise my father ever made to me. I replied, my eyes locked on his. The tension in the room skyrocketed. Mrs. Gable looked back and forth between us, clearly out of her depth. Carl's mask of civility began to crack. You have no idea what you're talking about, he hissed, leaning across the table. Everything I've done has been for your mother's benefit. Was selling my father's war medals for den decoration also for her benefit? I shot back, my voice dripping with ice. That was the line. I saw something snap behind his eyes. The narcissist's rage, the fury of being exposed, boiled to the surface. He shot up from his chair, his face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. I told you to stay out of it, he roared. His hand came up so fast I barely had time to register it. The slap was vicious, a full-force blow that sent a shockwave of pain through my jaw and cheek. My head snapped to the side, my ears ringing. But I didn't fall. I didn't even flinch. I slowly turned my head back to face him, my gaze unwavering and cold. I had anticipated this. In a tactical situation, you always anticipate the enemy's most desperate move. This was his. And it was the mistake I had been waiting for. Just as he opened his mouth to spit more venom, another voice cut through the tense silence. A voice that was calm, yet echoed with immense power and steel. I believe that is quite enough, Mr. Whitaker. The voice came from the corner of the room, from an area separated by a thin, beige privacy curtain. With a soft whoosh, the curtain was pulled aside. Sitting in a wheelchair was an elegant, silver-haired woman in her 70s. She held up her phone, the red light of its camera glowing like a damning eye. She was not a patient. She had been waiting. She had been watching. The blood drained from Carl's face. His arrogant posture deflated like a punctured balloon, replaced by the raw animal panic of being caught in a snare. Who the hell are you? He stammered, pointing a trembling finger at her. The woman powered off her phone and placed it deliberately in her purse. She looked at Carl with an expression of profound disgust. My name is Eleanor Vale, she said, her voice clear and precise. And I am the person who is going to ensure that what you just did destroys you. The name hung in the air. Vale. General Vale. Her late husband was a 4-star general, a military legend, a man whose portrait hung in the Pentagon. Eleanor Vale herself was a force of nature in the veteran community, a powerful philanthropist whose name opened every door in this town and in Washington, D.C. Carl's face went from white to a sickly shade of green. He understood instantly. He hadn't just assaulted his stepdaughter. Eleanor Vale rose from her wheelchair, her posture as straight and commanding as any soldier. My late husband, the general, she said, her eyes boring into Carl, used to say that the real wars are not fought between nations, but between dignity and depravity. Her gaze then shifted to me, and for the first time in days, I felt something other than the cold weight of isolation. I saw respect. I saw understanding. You are fighting for dignity, Captain, she said softly, but with the force of a command. She turned her attention back to the sputtering, terrified man who was once so confident. You just assaulted a decorated, active-duty officer of the United States Army, and you did it right in front of me. She walked over to me, her presence a shield of absolute authority. She placed a gentle hand on my arm, but her words were a declaration of war. Captain Collier, she said, her voice ringing with purpose. Your solo mission is over. As of now, you have a damn army behind you. She looked at me, a strategist ready to plan the next phase of an attack. Now, you tell me, where do we begin? Eleanor Vale was a woman who moved with the speed and precision of a military strike. The next morning, I wasn't in my childhood bedroom anymore. I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the top floor of a downtown law firm, the kind of place that smelled of expensive coffee and quiet power. This was the new war room. Across the polished mahogany table sat Daniel Brennan, Mrs. Vale's personal attorney. He was a former JAG prosecutor with intense, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. To his left was a forensic accountant, a woman who could make numbers sing, and to his right, a private investigator who looked like he'd stepped out of a classic noir film. This was the army Mrs. Vale had promised me. I walked them through my research, my voice steady as I detailed the shell corporations, the property transfers, the eBay sales. I handed them the USB drive containing my files and the audio recording from the hospital room. They spread my printed documents across the vast table, the evidence I had gathered alone in the dark now illuminated under the bright lights of this professional war room. When I finished, Daniel Brennan leaned back in his leather chair and looked at me, not with pity, but with a profound, validating respect. "Captain," he said, a small smile touching his lips, "the case file you've built here is more detailed than some I've gotten from FBI agents. It's ironclad." He leaned forward, his expression shifting from admiration to predatory focus. "Now, let's turn this intelligence into an indictment." For the first time in this whole ordeal, a surge of pure, unadulterated hope washed over me. Hearing my work validated by a man like him healed a wound I didn't even realize was still bleeding. The wound of being doubted by the very people who should have believed me. Brennan's team moved with breathtaking efficiency. There was no wasted time, no bureaucratic delay. Within hours, using the video of the assault and a sworn affidavit from Eleanor Vale, they filed an emergency petition with the county court. They didn't just ask for a restraining order, they alleged elder abuse, battery, and financial exploitation under duress. By late afternoon, a judge had signed the order. Carl Whitaker was legally barred from coming within 100 yards of my mother, Linda Collier. In one swift, strategic move, they had cut him off from his hostage and his primary source of funding. The first arrow had hit its mark. Of course, a cornered rat doesn't surrender. It bites. Carl's counterattack came 2 days later, not through the courts, but through the press. A headline on the front page of our local tabloid, the North Lake Chronicle, screamed, "Deputy Mayor Candidate's Troubled Veteran Stepdaughter, a Story of Manipulation." The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. Quoting an anonymous source close to the family, it painted me as a deeply disturbed veteran suffering from severe PTSD. It claimed I had a history of unstable and aggressive behavior in the military, and was now prone to delusions and paranoid fantasies. It was a complete fabrication, a disgusting lie designed to utterly destroy my credibility before I could even speak. I read the article online, my hands shaking with a powerless rage as I scrolled through the comments section. The poison had worked. People I had known my entire life, neighbors who had watched me grow up, were turning on me. "I always knew there was something off about that girl," one comment read. "She always had that intense look in her eyes." The casual cruelty of my own community, so quick to believe the worst, hurt more than I wanted to admit. I was sitting in Brennan's office when Mrs. Vale found me staring at the screen. She placed a firm, comforting hand on my shoulder. "When the enemy runs out of ammunition, they start throwing mud," she said, her voice calm and wise. "It's messy, it's ugly, but it's a sure sign that we're winning." Her words were a lifeline. She was right. This wasn't a setback, it was a reaction. It was the desperate flailing of a man who knew the truth was coming for him. While Carl was busy slinging mud, our team was focused on the next target. The private investigator, a man named Marcus, had been digging into the hospital staff. He zeroed in on the nurse who had been on duty when my mother's fentanyl dosage was increased, Teresa Coleman. She was a single mother with 2 kids and a mountain of debt. A perfect target for a man like Carl. Their approach was brilliant in its simplicity. Marcus didn't threaten her. He didn't intimidate. He approached her professionally in the parking lot after her shift. He presented her with a thin file folder. Inside was a single piece of paper, a bank statement showing 3 separate cash deposits into her account over the last month, totaling $5,000. The deposits were untraceable, but their timing coincided perfectly with my mother's surgery and Carl's visits. Marcus didn't need to say much. He explained the legal terms to her in plain language. Financial exploitation of the elderly. Medical battery. Conspiracy. Federal crimes. He told her there were 2 doors in front of her. Behind the door number 1, she was a cooperating witness for the prosecution, granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. Behind door number 2, she was a co-conspirator, facing a prison sentence that would take her away from her children for a very long time. He gave her Daniel Brennan's card. "You have 24 hours to decide which door you want to walk through," he said, and then he left. The clock was now ticking. We had severed Carl's access to my mother and weathered his public smear campaign. Now, we were moving to break his conspiracy from the inside. The feeling in the war room was electric. It was the tense, focused, adrenaline-fueled calm before a major assault. We were no longer on the defensive. The counteroffensive had begun. The 24-hour deadline we gave Nurse Teresa Coleman felt like an eternity. Every time my phone rang, I expected it to be Brennan telling me she'd lawyered up or disappeared. But just 19 hours after Marcus approached her, she walked into Daniel Brennan's office. She was terrified, her hands trembling as she clutched a worn-out purse, but she was ready to talk. Marcus conducted the interview in a small soundproofed room with a digital recorder running on the table. I listened from the conference room next door, the audio piped through a speaker. Teresa's voice was thin and shaky as she confessed everything. Mr. Whitaker, he was so charming at first, she began, her words tumbling out in a rush. He said his wife was in a lot of pain and that she was anxious about paperwork. He said he just needed her to be a little more comfortable and relaxed so she could sign some things to make his life easier. She took a ragged breath. He told me to just up the fentanyl drip a little. He handed me an envelope with $5,000 in cash. He said it was a gift for my troubles. I have 2 kids. My car just broke down. I didn't know he was so evil. I swear I didn't know. Her confession was the silver bullet we needed. But it was what came next that turned my blood to ice. While Teresa was talking, the forensic accountant slid a document across the table to Brennan. It was a copy of a life insurance policy. Carl had taken out a $2 million policy on my mother just 3 months before her scheduled surgery. He was the sole beneficiary. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just about getting a signature on a power of attorney. This was an execution in waiting. With Teresa's recorded confession secured, Brennan called me back into the main conference room. He spread my mother's medical charts across the table. "Elena," he said, his voice grim, "I need you to walk me through this, not as a daughter, but as a physician. What exactly was he trying to do?" I put on my professional armor, the detachment I learned in the ER. My duty as a medic took precedence over my grief as a daughter. I picked up a pen and pointed to the dosage logs. My voice was cold, clinical, and shaking with a fury I could barely contain. "This dosage of fentanyl," I began, "is 3 times the standard therapeutic dose for a post-op patient of my mother's weight and condition. This isn't pain management. This is intentional respiratory depression." I looked up, meeting Brennan's hard gaze. At this level, her breathing would slow to a critical point. She would become hypoxic, starving her brain of oxygen. A few more micrograms, a slight delay in a nurse's response, and she would have gone into full respiratory arrest. It would have been logged as a tragic post-surgical complication. I put the pen down, the plastic groaning under the pressure of my grip. He wasn't trying to sedate her, Daniel. He was setting the stage to murder her. The room was silent. The truth of it, stark and ugly, hung in the air. Carl hadn't just wanted her money. He'd wanted her dead. The next step was the hardest I've ever had to take. With the protection order in place, we had moved my mother to a different hospital across the county. A secure facility where she was slowly and safely being weaned off the high dose of narcotics. She was lucid now, her eyes clear for the first time in weeks. And I had to be the one to tell her that the man she loved had tried to kill her. I sat by her bedside in the quiet sunlit room, holding her hand. It felt frail in mine. I started gently, explaining that we had found some irregularities in her finances, that Carl had sold some things without her permission. She frowned, confused. "But Carl handles everything. He's so good with all that." Then, with a heavy heart, I laid it all out. The house, the medals, the lies. Finally, I told her about the fentanyl. I explained in the simplest medical terms I could what the dosage was meant to do. At first, she refused to believe it. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her eyes wide with denial. "No, not Carl. You're mistaken. He loves me." I didn't argue. I just slid my phone onto her blanket and played a 1-minute clip from Teresa Coleman's confession. He said he just needed her to be a little more comfortable. He handed me an envelope with $5,000. My mother listened, her face growing paler with every word. The denial in her eyes crumbled, replaced by a wave of sickening comprehension, then horror, then a deep, soul-shattering revulsion. The tears that filled her eyes weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of terror. She covered her mouth with her hand, a strangled sob escaping her lips. That monster, she choked out, her body trembling. I was sleeping next to a monster. Watching her world shatter was one of the most painful things I've ever had to do. My oath was to protect the health and lives of those in my care. Right then, I knew my mother was the most important patient I would ever have. Her physical healing had begun, but her real recovery was just starting. Later that day, Daniel Brennan made his final move. He didn't call the local police. This was bigger now. It turned out that Eleanor Vale's nephew was a high-ranking prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office. Brennan sent him the entire package. Teresa's taped confession, my medical analysis, the evidence of financial fraud, and a copy of the $2 million life insurance policy. The case was immediately elevated. It was no longer a local matter of elder abuse. It was now a federal investigation into wire fraud, conspiracy to commit assault, and attempted murder. The full weight of the United States government was about to come crashing down on Carl Whitaker. The noose we had been carefully weaving was now tightening around his neck. It's a horrifying thought, isn't it? To realize the person you trust most is your greatest threat. It makes you question everything. If you've ever had a gut feeling that something was deeply wrong, even when the world told you otherwise, please hit that like button to show your support. And in the comments, let me know one thing you've learned to always trust, whether it's your intuition, a close friend, or something else. Let's talk about trust. The week leading up to the deputy mayoral debate was chaotic. With the federal investigation closing in, Carl went into a frenzy. He was no longer a calculating predator. He was a cornered animal, lashing out blindly in every direction. His lawyers filed for a temporary restraining order against me, citing a fabricated campaign of harassment. It was a desperate, transparent attempt to legally bar me from attending the debate, the biggest political event of his life. But his most venomous attack was aimed directly at my heart. He filed a formal complaint with the Department of Defense. In it, he spun a wild tale, accusing me of using classified military resources and surveillance techniques to illegally monitor a private citizen, him. It was a lie, but it was a brilliant, vicious one. He wasn't just trying to discredit me in our small town. He was trying to burn my entire career to the ground. The complaint triggered an automatic internal investigation. I received a call from my commanding officer, Colonel Thompson. To his credit, his voice was supportive. "Elena," he said, his tone weary, "I've known you for 10 years. I know this is garbage, but my hands are tied. The process is the process. You're going to have to give a formal statement." Having to sit in a sterile office and explain the most painful details of my family's implosion to a JAG officer was a unique form of humiliation. My private life, my mother's vulnerability, my stepfather's crimes, it was all being entered into an official military record. Carl had managed to drag my two worlds together in the most toxic way imaginable. For a moment, the old fear crept back in. The chilling thought that this monster might actually get away with it. Then, the second blow landed. Daniel Brennan called an emergency meeting. "We have a problem," he said, his face grim. "Teresa Coleman just recanted her testimony." A collective groan went through the room. She was our star witness, our silver bullet. "What happened?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "Carl got to her," Marcus, the PI, answered, disgust thick in his voice. "We have it on good authority he funneled a substantial amount of money to her sister's account. He promised to pay for her kids' college education. He bought her silence." The air in the war room grew heavy. For the first time, a shadow of doubt fell over our carefully laid plans. Without her testimony, the medical malice charge became much harder to prove. We had the recording of her initial confession, but a good defense attorney could tear it apart in court, painting her as an unreliable, coerced witness. A flicker of triumph must have registered on Carl's face wherever he was. But he had underestimated Daniel Brennan. Daniel didn't flinch. He looked around the room at our worried faces and gave a sharp, decisive shake of his head. "This changes nothing," he said, his voice cutting through the gloom. "In fact, this helps us. Carl doesn't know we have his first confession on tape. A witness suddenly recanting after a large, unexplained payment to her family? That doesn't look like innocence. That screams consciousness of guilt. We'll use it against him." His confidence was contagious. The storm Carl had unleashed was terrifying, but our ship had a steady captain. One by one, Carl's attacks were dismantled. The judge for his restraining order request took one look at the video of him striking me and threw the case out of court in less than 5 minutes, warning Carl's lawyer not to waste his time again. The complaint to the Department of Defense was officially put on hold after Brennan's office notified them that I was a material witness in an active federal investigation, and that the complaint showed a clear pattern of witness intimidation and retaliation. Every desperate jab he threw was expertly parried. That night, I found myself unable to sleep. I went to the bookshelf in my father's old study and pulled out his worn, dog-eared copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War. He had underlined a passage: "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles." I knew the enemy. I knew his arrogance, his narcissism, his desperation. And I knew myself. I knew my training, my discipline, and the truth on my side. Reading my father's favorite book, I felt a profound sense of calm settle over me. We were ready. The night before the debate, our war room was a hive of quiet, focused activity. The final pieces were moving into place. Sealed manila envelopes, our intelligence packets, were prepared. Each one contained a curated selection of the most damning evidence: the video of the assault, the audio of Teresa's initial confession, the property records, the eBay screenshots, and the copy of the life insurance policy. They were addressed to the top editors at every major news outlet in the state, set to be delivered by courier the moment Carl took the stage. The federal arrest warrant had been signed by a judge that afternoon, sealed until the moment of execution. The U.S. Marshals were on standby. I went home to find my mother standing in front of her closet. She was holding up a powerful navy blue pantsuit. She looked at me, not with fear, but with a strength I hadn't seen in years. "Do you think this looks strong?" she asked. "It looks like you're ready for a fight, Mom," I said, my voice thick with pride. In my own room, I took out my Army service uniform, the formal dress uniform often called pinks and greens. I laid it out on my bed, the jacket with its rows of ribbons, the polished brass buttons gleaming under the lamplight. I took out the iron and began to press the sleeves with military precision, creating a perfect, sharp crease. This wasn't just about looking presentable. It was a ritual. I wasn't just preparing for an event. I was putting on my armor. I was preparing for battle. The North Lake Civic Center auditorium was packed to the rafters. The air buzzed with anticipation, the scent of stale popcorn mixing with the cheap perfume of local political hopefuls. I sat in the front row, flanked by my mother on one side and Eleanor Vale on the other. My Army service uniform felt like a suit of armor, its familiar weight grounding me. My mother, in her navy blue pantsuit, looked not like a victim, but like a stateswoman, her expression calm and resolute. I had never been prouder of her. Then he appeared. Carl strode onto the stage to a round of enthusiastic applause, waving to the crowd with the practiced ease of a seasoned politician. He basked in their admiration, his face a mask of confidence and charm. It was sickening. He launched into his opening remarks, his voice booming with false sincerity as he spoke of family values and the sacred duty of caring for our seniors. The hypocrisy was so thick I could taste it. The trap was sprung halfway through the debate. The moderator, a local journalist who had received one of our intelligence packets an hour earlier, looked down at her notes. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "A question from our online audience. A video has begun circulating in the last hour that appears to show you striking your stepdaughter, an active-duty Army captain. Do you have a comment on this? A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was it. The first shot had been fired. Carl, ever the performer, feigned a look of deep, sorrowful pain. He had prepared for this. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with faux compassion. "Thank you for asking that difficult question," he said, shaking his head sadly. "I love my stepdaughter very much. But it breaks my heart to admit that her experiences on the battlefield have left deep and painful scars. He was doing it. He was weaponizing my service, twisting my sacrifice into a diagnosis to save his own skin. She is not well," he continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "This is a cry for help from a troubled young woman, and my only concern is getting her the care she so desperately needs." He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully painted himself as the compassionate victim. But he never saw the real attack coming. That's when my mother stood up. A single, elegant movement in the front row, yet it commanded the attention of the entire room. Every head turned. The cameras zoomed in on her. She didn't look at me or Mrs. Vale. She walked with a steady, determined gait to the audience microphone set up in the aisle. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was not the weak, wavering voice of a victim. It was clear, it was strong, and it was amplified throughout the auditorium. "My name is Linda Whitaker," she announced, "and my daughter is not troubled. My daughter is a hero." A collective gasp went through the audience. On stage, Carl's face froze, his compassionate mask cracking. "The troubled one," my mother continued, her voice rising with righteous fury, her finger pointing directly at the man on the stage, "is the man up there, the man who systematically overdosed me on narcotics to steal my assets, the man who assaulted my daughter when she tried to protect me." The auditorium exploded, not into applause, but into a stunned, deafening silence, followed by a tidal wave of frantic whispers. The reporters in the press pit were scrambling, their faces a mixture of shock and glee. And in that moment of perfect chaos, Daniel Brennan stood up from his seat in the third row. "Carl Whitaker," he boomed, his prosecutor's voice cutting through the noise. "You are under arrest by order of the United States District Court." As if on cue, the lights in the auditorium seemed to brighten. Men in plainclothes, FBI agents, emerged from the wings of the stage and from the back of the hall, moving swiftly and purposefully towards Carl. His face, which had been frozen in shock, now crumpled into pure, pathetic terror. He looked like a cornered animal. Then, the final, devastating blow. The massive screen behind the stage, which had been displaying Carl's smiling campaign logo, flickered and changed. Suddenly, it was filled not with a logo, but with evidence. Screenshots of the Shell Corporation's registration, a list of my father's belongings sold on eBay, a transcript of Teresa's confession with the most damning lines highlighted in red, and then the finale, the video of the slap. Not the grainy cell phone version, but a high-resolution clip from Mrs. Vale's phone, played in brutal slow motion for the entire town to see. The crowd let out a collective, horrified groan. The takedown was absolute. It was public. It was irreversible. Two agents reached Carl, grabbing him by the arms. He didn't resist. He was a broken man. They pulled his hands behind his back, and the sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs being fastened seemed to echo through the silent room. As the agents led him off the stage and down the aisle, a remarkable thing happened. An elderly man in the front row, wearing a VFW cap, slowly got to his feet. He looked at me, his back ramrod straight, and raised his hand in a crisp, formal military salute. Then, another man in the row behind him stood and did the same. And another. Soon, a dozen veterans, men and women, were on their feet throughout the auditorium, not looking at the disgraced politician, but looking at me, their hands raised in a silent, powerful gesture of solidarity and respect. Tears welled in my eyes as I returned the salute. Carl was led right past our row. For a fleeting second, his eyes met mine. They were filled with a venomous, bottomless hatred. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt a cold, clinical finality. I met his hateful glare and spoke, my voice low and calm, for his ears only. "That was a tactical error, Carl," I said. I just documented it. The fall of Carl Whitaker's empire was as swift as it was brutal. The public arrest at the debate was a political killshot. His campaign imploded overnight. His donors vanished, his political allies issued press releases distancing themselves from him, and the party disavowed his candidacy. The federal prosecutor moved quickly, freezing all of his known assets and bank accounts, effectively cutting off his ability to hire the kind of high-powered legal team that could delay justice. As for Nurse Teresa, she was apprehended by federal agents at a bus station in Indiana, trying to flee the state. Carl's entire world, built on a foundation of lies, had crumbled into dust in a single night. The aftermath felt less like a victory celebration and more like the quiet, weary dawn after a long and brutal battle. A week after the arrest, I received 2 letters. The first was from North Lake Hospital. It was a formal, groveling apology from Dr. Albright and the board of directors. They offered to reinstate my privileges and publicly clear my name. I accepted their apology, but on one condition. I told them I would consult with them free of charge to help establish a new patient advocacy program, one specifically designed to protect elderly and veteran patients from financial and medical abuse. It was a small step, but it was a way to turn our painful experience into a shield for someone else. The second letter was from my commanding officer. It was an official notice that the internal investigation against me had been closed and all complaints were deemed unfounded. But at the bottom of the typed page, Colonel Thompson had added a handwritten note. It read, "Your father would be incredibly proud of you, Captain. So is your country." Reading those words, I felt a knot of tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying finally release. My honor, the one thing Carl had tried so desperately to take from me, was intact. My mother and I drove home from the hospital together after she was discharged. The car was silent. There was no triumphant music on the radio, no celebratory chatter. The air was thick with the exhaustion of war and the heavy weight of all that had been broken. It wasn't the elation of victory, it was the profound fatigue of survival. When we pulled into the driveway, my mother got out of the car and walked into the house with a strange, determined purpose. I followed her into the living room. She went straight to the wall above the fireplace, to the massive, smiling campaign portrait of Carl. Without a word, she lifted it off the hook. The frame was heavier than she expected, and she staggered back a step. I rushed forward to help her, and together, we lowered the portrait to the floor, leaning its grinning face against the wall. She stared at the empty space on the wall, at the single, lonely picture hook. A faint rectangle of cleaner paint marked where the portrait had hung, like a ghost. "I am so sorry, Elena," she whispered, her voice choked with shame. "I was so blind." I didn't say, "It's okay." It wasn't okay. Instead, I just put my arm around her. "You're not blind anymore, Mom," I said softly. "That's what matters." The days that followed were difficult. The fallout wasn't just legal, it was social. My mother's phone, which once buzzed constantly, was now mostly silent. Some of her friends, women she had known for decades, couldn't look her in the eye. They had been charmed by Carl, had invested in his campaign, had told everyone what a wonderful man he was. My mother's victimization was an uncomfortable mirror for their own poor judgment, and it was easier for them to blame her for being foolish than to admit they had been fooled, too. She was drowning in shame and guilt, replaying every moment, every lie she had believed. I found myself in a new role, not as a soldier or an investigator, but as a caregiver, sitting with her through the long nights as she grieved not for the man he was, but for the man she thought he was. I didn't need inspiration from a book or a podcast anymore. My mission now was her. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from the county jail. The handwriting was Carl's familiar, arrogant scrawl. I opened it with a sense of clinical detachment. It was 12 pages of pure, undiluted narcissism. He never once apologized. Instead, he blamed me for destroying his life, accused my mother of being an ungrateful liar, and painted himself as the ultimate victim. It was a pathetic, manipulative tirade. I read the first page, then folded it back up. I didn't burn it, I didn't tear it up. That would have been an emotional response, and he wasn't worth the energy. I simply put it in a fresh envelope and gave it to Daniel Brennan. It was just more evidence for the prosecution. That weekend, my mom and I began the final act of exorcism. We bought dozens of cardboard boxes and packing tape. We started in the master bedroom and we went through the entire house, systematically removing every trace of him. His expensive suits, his polished shoes, his collection of self-help books written by celebrity CEOs. We packed his golf clubs, his monogrammed whiskey glasses, his framed photo with the governor. We worked in a quiet, focused rhythm, a two-person team on a final, crucial mission. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. Every item we placed in a box was a silent declaration. This is not our life anymore. He does not belong here. This space is ours. When we were finished, the garage was filled with neatly labeled boxes. The next morning, a truck from the Salvation Army came and hauled it all away. As we watched it drive down the street, a palpable sense of peace settled over the house for the first time in years. We had finally, definitively, drawn the line. We had cleared the battlefield. 6 months later, I sat in the back of a federal courtroom, watching the final act of our play unfold. Carl Whitaker, stripped of his tailored suits and his political ambitions, stood before the judge in a drab orange jumpsuit. He looked smaller, grayer, a hollowed-out version of the monster who had haunted our lives. The sentencing was swift. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence, he had taken a plea deal. The judge, a stern woman with piercing eyes, made a point to read a statement into the record before delivering the sentence. She spoke of Carl's crimes not just in legal terms, but in moral ones. She called his actions a dual betrayal of this nation's core values, the exploitation of a vulnerable elder and the assault on a uniformed member of the armed forces. Then she delivered the sentence: 28 years in federal prison. Justice, full and final, had been served. There was no joy in that moment, only a profound and quiet sense of peace. The war was finally, truly over. With Carl's conviction, Daniel Brennan was able to have the fraudulent sale of the Oak Hills cabin nullified. A month later, my mother and I drove up the winding dirt road, the scent of pine and damp earth welcoming us home. The cabin looked just as I remembered it, a little weathered, a little neglected, but standing strong. It was ours again. Our first project was reclaiming the front porch. We found 2 cans of paint in the old shed and spent the afternoon together, sanding down and repainting the wooden porch swing my father had built. We chose his favorite color, a cheerful sky blue. We didn't talk much as we worked. The only sounds were the scrape of sandpaper on wood and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. It was a comfortable, healing silence. We weren't just painting a swing. We were restoring a piece of our history, covering the dark years with a fresh coat of hope. While cleaning out the dusty shed, we stumbled upon a weathered wooden footlocker tucked away in a corner. It was my father's. Inside, nestled amongst old photographs and service records, was a small, sealed box. I opened it to find a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were letters he had written to me during his last deployment, but had never sent. My hands trembled as I opened the one on top. His familiar, strong handwriting filled the page. The last paragraph struck me right in the heart. "This world can be a harsh and cruel place sometimes, Lainey," he wrote. "But you were born with a soldier's heart. Never forget that. Always be the soldier who fights for what's right, especially when no one else will." Tears streamed down my face as I read his words. He had been gone for years, but in that moment, it felt like he was right there, giving me my final orders. I had completed the mission he had entrusted to me. His legacy wasn't in the medals Carl had tried to sell. It was in the strength he had passed down to me. The changes in my mother were the most profound victory of all. The woman who had been a ghost in her own home began to return. At Mrs. Vale's suggestion, she joined a support group for survivors of emotional and financial abuse. For the first time, she was in a room with other women who understood her story without judgment. She started talking, then sharing, then leading. She found her voice again. One afternoon, a few months after we had moved back into the cabin, she was telling me a funny story about a woman in her group, and she let out a loud, uninhibited laugh. It was a sound I hadn't heard in nearly a decade. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. She caught me staring, a wide smile on my face. She reached out and squeezed my hand. "You saved me, Elena," she said, her eyes shining with tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude. In more ways than one. The story ends here, on this porch, with my mother. The sun is setting over the lake, painting the calm water in shades of gold and deep purple. I'm not in my uniform anymore. I'm wearing a simple t-shirt and a pair of worn-out jeans. My mother is next to me, a glass of iced tea in her hand, a genuine, peaceful smile on her face. I'm no longer a soldier in a battle. I am a daughter at home. Carl Whitaker thought a single violent slap could extinguish a fire. He never understood the heart of a soldier or the love of a daughter. He didn't know that his act of cruelty wouldn't put the fire out. It would only cause it to erupt into a wildfire, a cleansing blaze that would burn his entire empire of lies to the ground. And from those ashes, we rebuilt our home. Thank you for being here with me, on this porch, as I share the end of my war and the beginning of my peace. My father's legacy wasn't the house or his medals. It was the strength he passed down, the belief that we must always fight for what's right. I'd love to know, what is one piece of strength or wisdom someone passed down to you that you carry every day? Please share it in the comments below. Sharing these stories is how we remind each other we aren't alone. If my story resonated with you, please show your support with a like and subscribe for more stories of resilience and justice. Thank you for listening.